The Vietnam War. Wow. It's a name that brings up so much, right? For a whole generation, this was the conflict. It wasn't just a war fought in some far-off jungle. It was fought in living rooms, on TV screens, and right out on the streets. It's got to be one of the most complicated, most divisive conflicts of the entire 20th century. So let's try to unravel this thing together.
So what was this war really about? I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? Was it a fight for freedom, a civil war for Vietnam to finally become its own country after 100 years of being ruled by someone else? Or was it just one more move in a giant global chess game, a proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union? Well, the truth is, it's messy. It's really, really complicated.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, you've got to see it from two totally different angles. On one side, for the Vietnamese people, this was the final chapter in a long, long fight to just be independent. But for the big superpowers, it was all about one thing: stopping the spread of communism.
Right. And this is super important. This war didn't just pop up out of nowhere in the 1960s when American GIs showed up. No way. The real story, the roots of this whole thing, they go way, way back, like over a century earlier. It all started with a long, painful history of other countries calling the shots in Vietnam.
So let's just run through this real quick. It all kicks off in 1857. France rolls in and takes over. Then jump ahead to World War II, and Japan's in charge. This is when a guy named Ho Chi Minh steps up. He creates this group called the Viet Minh, and their whole goal is independence. But here's the kicker. When Japan loses the war in 45, do the Allies just say, okay, Vietnam, you're free? Nope. They actually split the country up. And then France comes back, trying to get its old colony, which starts the First Indochina War. You can see, this fight for freedom was already a long, brutal slog. So that war with the French ends in 1954. But it's not like everyone just shook hands and went home. Peace? Not even close. Instead, you get this big international agreement, the Geneva Accords, that basically puts a line down the middle of the country. And in doing so, it creates this total powder keg, just waiting to explode.
And look at this, it lays out the split perfectly. Up in the north, you've got Ho Chi Minh. He's communist, his capital's Hanoi, and he's got the Soviet Union and China in his corner. Then down south, you've got Ngo Dinh Diem. He's anti-communist, capitalist, based in Saigon, and he's backed by the United States. So you've got two leaders, two completely different systems, two Vietnams, and both of them are saying, we are the real Vietnam.
Now here's the thing that changes everything. This split, it was never supposed to be permanent. The Geneva Accords actually promised a big election in 2 years to bring the whole country back together. But that election never happened. The leader in the South, Diem, with the U.S. whispering in his ear, just canceled it. And why'd he do that? Simple. He was terrified he'd lose to the super popular Ho Chi Minh. And that one decision, that's what really lit the fuse. Okay, so with no election on the horizon, the fight between North and South just gets uglier. And as things got worse, the United States found itself getting pulled in further and further, all because of this one big fear that was hanging over everything at the time, the Cold War.
And that fear had a name: the domino theory. This was the idea that drove everything for the US back then. They literally pictured a row of dominoes. If Vietnam fell to communism, bam, the next country would fall, and the next, all across Southeast Asia. So for American presidents, stopping the first domino from falling in Vietnam was absolutely critical. It wasn't just about Vietnam, it was about stopping communism everywhere.
So how did the U.S. go from just sending advisors to sending in the cavalry? Well, it all comes down to one event: the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. The story was that North Vietnam had attacked U.S. ships. Now, people have argued about what really happened there for years, but at the time, that was all Congress needed to hear. They passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which basically gave President Johnson a blank check to send in combat troops. And just like that, the war went into overdrive.
And when I say overdrive, I mean it. Just look at this number. By 1967, at the absolute peak, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. Think about that. This thing that started with a few advisors had exploded into a massive American war. But this was a completely different kind of war. The U.S. brought the thunder, right? They had overwhelming firepower, huge bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder, and nasty chemical weapons like napalm and Agent Orange. But their enemy, the Viet Cong guerrillas in the South, they didn't fight that way. They used the jungle like a weapon. We're talking guerrilla warfare, hidden tunnels, booby traps. They were like ghosts, a totally invisible enemy that just wouldn't quit. So even with all that military power, the U.S. was stuck. The war just kept dragging on and on.
And then came 1968. This was the year everything changed. A couple of really shocking events happened that completely flipped the script, not just in Vietnam, but back home in America.
The big one was the Tet Offensive. Out of nowhere, North Vietnam launches this huge, coordinated attack all across the South. They even hit the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Now, technically, from a military standpoint, the attack failed, but that didn't matter. Psychologically, it was a massive, massive win for the North. Why? Because it showed everyone back in the States who'd been told for years that the U.S. was winning that, hey, the enemy is a lot stronger than you think, and this war is nowhere near over.
And this was the first time a war was really broadcast on TV every night. People saw the brutality firsthand. They saw horrible things like the My Lai massacre, where American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed civilians. It was sickening. Then, to make things even worse, the Pentagon Papers got leaked, and they proved the government had been lying to everyone about how the war was going. After that, public trust just vanished, and the anti-war protests, they absolutely exploded. So all this anger and frustration at home leads to a big political change. Richard Nixon becomes president in 1969, and he runs on a promise of peace with honor. He starts this new policy called Vietnamization. The basic idea was, let's pull our troops out slowly and at the same time train and equip the South Vietnamese army so they can fight this war on their own. This was it, the beginning of the end for America's role in Vietnam. So, as the U.S. starts to pull out, the war enters its final, really tragic phase. And what it leaves behind is just a legacy of unbelievable destruction and a human cost that's almost too big to wrap your head around. Here's how it all went down. Step 1, January 73, the Paris Peace Accords gets signed. That's the official end of America's part in the fighting. Step 2, by March, the last of the U.S. combat troops are on their way home. But the war wasn't over for the Vietnamese. The Civil War kept going for 2 more years. And then step 3, April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crash through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war is over, and Vietnam is one country again, under communist rule.
The cost, it's just staggering. For America, more than 58,000 service members never came home. But that number, as big as it is dwarfed by the losses for the Vietnamese people. We're talking an estimated 1.2 million people killed, soldiers and civilians from the North and the South.
And on top of that, another 150,000 civilians were wounded. I mean, the sheer scale of the loss is just, it's hard to even process.
The war touched everything. It destroyed families, villages, the land itself. But after all that, after a century of fighting foreign powers and then themselves, the one thing that had started it all was finally a reality. Vietnam was a single, independent country.
And that leaves us with one last tough question. When you look back at all that destruction, at the millions of people who died, you just have to ask, was it worth it? Was getting a unified country worth that terrible, terrible price? It's a question that, honestly, there's no easy answer to. And it's something people are still wrestling with to this very day.